I wanted to focus on a fundamental question. Why don't Democrats on this committee want to know how the virus started? 17 months, 150 million cases worldwide, 600,000 Americans lost their lives. Where did this thing start? Did it jump from an animal to humans, or was it a leak from a lab in Wuhan, China? American people probably like to know. After all, they've had their liberties assaulted for the past year. The World Health Organization did a study and issued a report. The same World Health Organization that Republicans on this committee asked to come in front of this committee 3 separate times, and the Democrats denied us our request. Their report said this, quote, "It was extremely unlikely that the lab leak was the cause." Just one problem with that finding. Nobody believes them. President Biden's Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, said this, "That's not our assessment." Secretary of State Blinken said, "We've got real concerns about the methodology and process that went into the WHO report." Secretary of Health and Human Services Becerra, former colleague of ours, said, quote, "We have to understand how COVID surfaced, but the Select Committee in Congress on COVID doesn't want to know." Journalists want to know. Josh Rogan, Washington Post column 2 weeks ago, he starts his column off by quoting our colleague, Congressman Gallagher. "Understanding the cause of the pandemic and ensuring that something like it never happens again is the most important question we face." He goes on to say this, "The Republicans are taking the first steps in a long overdue effort, but without backing from Democrats, who are conspicuously absent from these efforts, the investigations will struggle." Very true. The Select Committee on the coronavirus won't look into how coronavirus started. I find that fascinating. I find that amazing. Nicholas Wade, former New York Times science writer, said this when looking at the 2 scenarios. He says, quote, "It's a stretch to get the pandemic to break out naturally outside of Wuhan and then without leaving a trace to make its first appearance in Wuhan." But he says this, for the lab escape scenario, a Wuhan origin for the virus is a no-brainer. Wuhan is home to China's leading center for coronavirus research. Researchers were genetically engineering bat coronaviruses to attack human cells. They were doing so under minimal safety conditions. If the virus with an unexpected infectiousness had been generated there, its escape would be no surprise. Journalists want to know. Secretary of State wants to know. Secretary of Health and Human Services want to know, journalists want to know, Republicans want to know, Americans want to know. Why don't Democrats in Congress want to know where this thing started? Is it because Speaker Pelosi called it a diversion last year when we were raising these questions and asking to have these witnesses brought in front of us? Or maybe it's because Dr. Fauci, the all-knowing Dr. Fauci, who Mr. Rogan in his piece said has, quote, repeatedly thrown cold water on the lab leak theory, maybe Dr. Fauci would have to answer some tough questions if we actually dug into how this thing started. Remember, Dr. Fauci gave EcoHealth $3 million. EcoHealth then gave $600,000 to the Wuhan lab. Did Dr. Fauci know about this arrangement when he okayed the grant? Did Dr. Fauci know the Wuhan lab did not operate with the highest level of safety standards as reported by our own State Department personnel in China? How about the process? There's a review board at HHS for any grants that do, quote, gain-of-function research. Now, 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci told Senator Paul that the grant to Wuhan lab was not, quote, gain-of-function research. But several respected doctors disagree, say it was. How does this review board process work? Who sits on the board? The truth is, nobody knows. The only thing we know about this board is its chairman, and we only know that because he disclosed it in January 2020. Report here. Chris Hassel, the chairman, disclosed his involvement January 2020 in a talk before the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. He said during the talk that the current definition of what comes in front of his board is, quote, very narrow. Quote, I'll just probably be more frank than may be appropriate. I think it's too narrow. He then went on and suggested that the government could be funding gain-of-function research that his committee hasn't vetted. There's some important questions there for Dr. Fauci. How about the fundamental question? The fundamental question. Why are we funding research in a lab in Wuhan, China in the first place? Why are we doing that? I think the American people like to know, especially what they've went through over the last year. And just as important, Mr. Chairman, Why won't this committee, the only committee in the United States Congress, focus solely on the coronavirus? Why won't we? Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Rosen, 4 years ago on January 6, 2017, was it appropriate for Democrats to object to the 2016 presidential election results?
Congressman, I think the things that are appropriate or inappropriate for Congress to do are that all members, of course, and all the rest of us have to adhere to the Constitution. And so I'm going to say that that's an issue for you as members of Congress to assess.
Well, you're former acting attorney general. We appreciate your service to the country. I'm just asking, was it okay for them to? They've told us we're not allowed to object. We weren't allowed to object on January 6, 2021. In fact, you're not even allowed to co-sponsor legislation that Democrats introduced if you did object to accepting and counting the electors on January 6, 2021. I'm just wanting your thoughts on, was it okay for Democrats to do that on January 6, 2017?
What I would hope is people of all parties, all political perspectives, would respect the Constitution, our system of government, and the rule of law.
And does the Constitution allow members to object to the Electoral College results on January 6 after a presidential election?
My understanding is that it does.
It does, right. And Democrats did it. I mean, we had Jim McGovern, the Democrat chairman of the Rules Committee. He objected to the very first state called. He objected to Alabama back on January 6, 2017. State President Trump won by 30 points. Mr. Raskin objected to Florida. Mrs. Waters objected to Wyoming, maybe the only state that President Trump won by more than he won Alabama. She objected to Wyoming. And you're saying that was okay for Democrats to do? Mr. Rosen, that was fine?
Oh, I'm sorry, Congress. I didn't understand if you were asking me to respond to that. Again, I mean, I think is
it okay for Jim McGovern, a Democrat member of Congress, to object to Alabama on January 6, 2017? Is that all right? He's allowed to do that, right?
I think if members are adhering to their constitutional rights and roles and responsibilities, that's, again, a question for all the folks in Congress.
And Ms. Waters can object to Wyoming, even though President Trump won Wyoming by like 40 points. She can object to that if she wants to, right?
Well, at least the Constitution allows members of Congress to raise objections. Yeah.
We've heard a lot of talk from the Democrats about revisionist history and the big lie. I just think it's important that we've had Democrat members of Congress tell us that we weren't allowed to object, that somehow we were trying to overturn the will of the American people, even though we objected to states like Pennsylvania, for example, where they, I believe in an unconstitutional fashion, changed their election laws in the run-up to the election, but somehow they're allowed to object to Alabama, they're allowed to object to Wyoming, they're allowed to object to Florida, but we're not allowed to object. I fail to see the logic there. How about the previous gentleman from Virginia talked about brutality, talked about statements. I just want to read you a couple statements here. Well, no, let me ask you this question first. Was the 2016 election stolen?
I do not know of evidence that would say it was. I think you're alluding to a troublesome thing about the legitimacy of our past elections, sometimes governors' races being called into question. And I think it's really necessary and important for all of us to find ways to restore our citizens' faith in the electoral process and in our representative system of government.
Secretary Clinton said on a speaking tour, May 2019, you can run the best campaign, you can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you. September 2019, she said on CBS Sunday Morning that President Trump was an illegitimate president. On October 2020, just a month before our last presidential election, she was referring to the 2016 presidential election, and she said it was stolen from her. Is she wrong?
She is wrong.
Yeah, she is wrong, because the election was valid in 2016. President Trump won. So when we talk about revisionist history that we've heard from the Democrats, when we talk about the big lie, their nominee, as recently as last October, was saying the election in 2016 was stolen. They can object to Alabama. They can object to Wyoming. They can object to states when in 2017, but we're somehow not allowed to object to anything and raise points about the 2020 election. It's not about revisionist history. It's about the double standard the Democrats want to have. That's the part that